Okay, so let's talk about Python development for a little bit, and at least in my world, in the world of web development. One of the things that we do a lot of is data input in forms. So CRUDs, create, read, update, delete situations. So we have a form, and we need to enter data in it. We need to edit data that's in it. We need to have a management screen that kind of shows the rows, and we usually typically want to search that. And then you need to be able to delete those records. So that's just a very common pattern for a lot of things. In our world, we find ourselves building those kind of interfaces a lot. And so once you've defined the data model, once you know at a database level what's your table going to look like, what are your fields going to look like, and what are your relationships going to look like, there's a lot of times where all the other layers of things that you have to set up are just almost, is just very repetitive, in the sense that my system already really knows the fields that I need. I already have a user object. It already has a set of fields. I already know things about those fields. Like, for instance, if I have a database field that is 50 characters long, why do I have to tell my form library that it has a max length of 50? If the database knows that field is not nullable, why do I have to tell the form field that it's required? What are some other things that we might know? If I use something like Django and I have an email field, why do I have to tell my form to make sure and validate that field as a valid email stream? So there's just a lot of things that, depending upon how rich your database layer is, your ORM layer, there's a lot of things that can be extrapolated from that, if you can get it there. The difficulty in those situations is that a lot of times the way that people build those generators is not very flexible, and so what ends up happening is it only works if the library that's creating all those other layers, if the assumptions that it makes fit yours exactly, and if it doesn't, if the library is not designed right, it can be really hard to do simple overrides, right? So instead of being able to say, oh, this form is not required in my database, or this field is not required in my database, but in my form I actually want it required, sometimes you have to completely redefine the field, which isn't helpful. I'd like to just be able to say, hey, on this field, take what's already there and just change the requirement from false to true. Is everybody tracking with that? Anybody have any concerns about that or any questions initially? And so you'll find a lot of these type of, they're not really generators. What are they? They're usually libraries. There are some things that will generate do code generation. I usually avoid those because once you generate the code, if you change the model, you got to regenerate the code, and then if you've updated the code that exists at all, you blow away your changes, and that's just bad. That's just bad too. So you'll find a lot of these in Python that'll automatically do this. What are some popular form libraries in Python? Throw some out there. What do you know about? Yeah, Django's got everything for you built in. It all kind of fits together. What else is out there for people who haven't drank the Django Kool-Aid?
Forms.
What the forms? It's a very popular one. Pyramid has its own, the Pyramid framework. Is it Pylons or Pyramid these days? Pyramid. They've got some stuff going on. I don't track them very closely. I can't remember it. But I know that there's generators for what the forms. So I know that you can generate what the forms, form objects out of your SQLAlchemy data models. We use that in our library called KEG. There's also libraries that will take kind of that form definition and create UI for you. So once you've created the form, it'll generate the HTML. One of the things that I ran across recently is that there is project called JSON schema. And the whole point of JSON schema is to give you a standard way to basically describe data models with JSON. So that's pretty interesting because this, once I actually came across this, I thought, I'll bet you $100 if there's people building React libraries that if you feed it a JSON, this JSON blob, it'll automatically turn that into a form. And so sure enough, that's what we have here. In React JSON schema form, which is a really unique and unpredictable name. And this is their playground. So ultimately what they're doing is they're taking this blob of JSON, this schema, and they're feeding it to the library, and that library is actually doing the work of creating the form labels and creating the form it's not creating the data, form labels and form fields, and they're even doing stuff like validation automatically. I will pick the one that doesn't work. So that one works. So they're even doing real-time validation just based on the JSON schema. And so when I saw this, I realized, I know that there's libraries in Python that'll take my SQLAlchemy entity models and turn those into Python side kind of validation or form libraries. So in some sense, form libraries, like what the forms, they have two things that they do. One is they basically serialize and deserialize your data and do validation in that process. So they take input and they do type conversion and they do validation, and they go from one form like a form post to a different form, which would be a series of Python objects that I can work with. The other thing that form libraries do is the UI part, and so they're going to have widgets, and they're going to give you easy ways to create HTML widgets that correspond to those fields. What the forms does all of that. It's designed to do all of that. There are other libraries that are focused just on the serialization and deserialization and validation problems. So they kind of ignore the UI and they say, we're just going to deal with the data. I had always been a proponent of letting the form library build my UI until JavaScript really started to become popular, and there was more and more need to do dynamic forms. And then once that happened, the kind of the old style form generation that we were doing really started to show its age. And so we did use what the forms for a while, but even in that, what we realized is a lot of times we just created template helpers rather than generating the form all at once. We would create a template helper that would know how to take a select field and render it. And so we were still in our Jinja templates. If you had 12 fields, you'd still have to call that. You'd still have to have 12 field renders in that form. But it gave you more flexibility to kind of configure your form, group things, not have everything just be on one line. If you had 3 fields for a social security number for some reason, you could kind of group those all together. And it was a little bit easier and a little bit more flexible than the older generation of form generators, which just kind of generated the entire form at once. And so where I'm going with this is in my thought process, I've been moving more and more towards, it would be really nice if I only had to define most of my validation, most of my data model once, and then I could take everything else and kind of put it in React, or put it on deal with it on the JavaScript side. So I'm progressively moving all of my UI work, where it used to be in HTML. Even with Jinja, it was I could change it obviously with a page refresh, but I'm limited based on what the user is doing in the form, changing it at that point. Usually in the past, relying on something like jQuery, just coming to realize that the tools that React and other frameworks are providing are just providing a better user experience, and wanting to be able to capitalize on that without spending a lot of time copy and pasting, basically the same field definition in 3 or 4 places, right? I create it in SQLAlchemy and my core entity layer, and then I create it in the marshmallow, which is the serialization layer, and then I have to be in React, and I've got to create a data model in React, and it's just like, why do I have to keep doing all this? It's just, I had one field, I got to touch 4 files, and in the spirit of dry, don't repeat yourself, it'd be really nice if I could figure out a way to not have to do that. And so when I came across JSON schema and I came across this React JSON schema forms library, I thought, okay, let's see what we have to do to be able to specify my schema, specify my data model in SQLAlchemy where it has to be, because that's where Python is interacting with the database. Let's start there, and let's see if I can build a pipeline basically that'll get me all the way out to React and generate my form without me having to do really any extra work. Does that make sense? Anybody have questions about that? If you do, raise your hand now and let's try to talk about it, because I'm going to jump into the code here in just a second. Okay. Who does not know what SQLAlchemy is? Who does, all of you raise your hand, do you know what ORMs are? Who doesn't know what an ORM is? Object Relational Mapper. I got 1, he's smiling at me. 2. 2 what? Okay. Oh, because I posted. Okay. So almost any programming language worth its salt is going to give you the ability to interact with the database, whether that's Microsoft SQL Server or PostgreSQL or MySQL or some of the key value stores like MongoDB. Give me another one. Elasticsearch. Okay, so you got lots of opportunities to connect. But especially with SQL, writing SQL ends up being really verbose if you got to write every single query, and it just really slows down development. So an object relational mapper is a library that gives you the ability to define your data model with the objects that you deal with in your language, and then the library is going to take care of the translation, at least most of it, to actual SQL and interaction with the database. So if I was going to create a database and I wanted to create a user object, I would have to write in SQL, I would have to create a table statement that was called users that had a bunch of fields in it, right? That makes sense. But I really don't want to do that, especially because all of my applications have the same needs. All of my applications need to define a model, they need to be able to create the tables, they need to be able to do selects, they need to be able to do deletes, and all that stuff is very common and very standard. To have to manually write SQL every time I want to do that, it's just not very productive as a developer. Enter SQLAlchemy, or if you want to do this with Django, you can do it with Django. Django's got its own ORM built in. And so in SQLAlchemy, once you have everything kind of set up properly, you see that? Should I make that bigger? Yeah. Okay. So this is all I have to do now in my code using an object relational mapper, in particular SQLAlchemy, to create a user's object. The DB model and the entity mixin. The DB model comes from a library called Flask SQLAlchemy, so they're taking care of, for me, they're taking care of the boilerplate of integrating a Flask web application and its lifecycle things, and the SQLAlchemy in particular, its session model. And in SQLAlchemy, the session is the database session, not the web session, so don't confuse those. That was a really big point of confusion for me when I started using SQLAlchemy. So that's where the DB.model is coming from. And then the entity mixin is a really shallow layer that's just giving me some default columns like the ID column. So all of our data models always have an ID, a created timestamp, and an updated timestamp. And there's no sense, once again, dry. I don't want to repeat that every single time. So I put that in the default columns mixin. And then the method mixin, there's certain things that we like to have on our methods. One of them is just really helpful called testing create. It's a method that we call that will automatically populate your entity with junk data based on the type of field that it is. And so that's a really easy way for us when we're testing, because we're big on automated testing. When I just need a user object and I really don't care what it is, I can just call user.testingCreate, and now I have an object and it has data in it. And so for something like, it went away. For something like user, it's not really that big of a deal. There's only 5 fields, and it's maybe not, the need is not necessary. But when you're like 3 or 4 layers deep and you just need that one object, but it needs 4 parent objects to have your data, to be able to call testing create and know that your model is going to create all of those needed parent objects just as junk objects, it doesn't matter. But boy, that's so helpful to have that. So I'll show you the use case for testing create here in just a second. But so inside of this framework that we call KEG, there's a lot of helper methods. There's methods to automatically set up this database table when the project starts, or based on a command that I run. Yeah, that's kind of it. So questions, comments about what an ORM is, what this user object in particular does for us.
For example, I'm using PV.
You're using Peewee, yeah?
So this, that was like SQLAlchemy.
Same thing. Yep. I mean, not exactly the same, but same concept. They're both object relational mappers.
You create a object and you like, it's like you have to create like an object and database. I don't even.
So all I have to create is my model right here, and then I can call, so from my command line, if I wanted to create the database with the user table in it, here, let me do this. $54.33, is that right? The Postgres? $54.32 is default? Mine's on 3. So let's try this. Let's see if this works. So I can go, what? Not this one, not very easily. So rapid, develop, DB, init. So I didn't have the driver between Python and PostgreSQL installed. That's what I'm doing now. Database R Syring does not exist. I'm going to use test. Yay. Okay, so actually let's do this. And I'm going to use clear first. So this this command that I'm using here is just part of the framework that we use, the KEG framework. If you were going to build something yourself, you would probably use the CLI tools in Flask, or something like Click, which is a library to kind of build some of these tools. We use them all the time. We always need the same tools, so we just build them into the higher level library so they're easy to use. So if we look at PG admin, and we go to my 9.6 version, and we look at test, and we look at the tables, we see that I've got the user object here. Yeah, I don't know really how to make that bigger. But it's there. The table's there, and all of the fields that are there, and I could do that. The system knows how to create the tables itself, which is really, really helpful in development environments and for testing, because it means that my tests can be completely self-sustained. The tests know how to create the database that it needs, so as long as it has a valid database, the tests are really easy for the developer to run, which is one of the most important things about tests. Developers have a tendency to be lazy. If something's hard or doesn't work well, they're not going to do it, and you want them to run the test, so you want that to be as easy as possible. Man, that's really annoying. Okay, any questions about the user object here, or what it does for us from a database perspective? Okay, so the first step is on the Python side. Can somebody tell me why we wouldn't want to, if we had a form and it was going to be in JavaScript, and we were going to let people, for instance, submit data to us through the form, which makes sense. I was trying to think of something that would be important. So let's say we had a drop-down. We had a drop-down with options in states that you live in. Why would it be important to not accept exactly what the user sends you and insert it into your table? Okay, good. So there's some SQL injection issues if you took it directly. What else? From a validation perspective, what's the problem? So I've got a list of drop-down. I've got a list of items in my drop-down. If I simply took what the user gave me and inserted it into my table, what if they inserted 0, 0 into my states column? Would that be a problem? It would, right? So when we do validation on the user side for usability purposes. We do validation on the server side for data integrity purposes. They're completely different. They're completely different reasons. The user, ultimately, at the end of the day, anything that a JavaScript form can submit to us, a smart user or a bot of some kind can submit that same data to us however they want to. So even though I've got a JavaScript validator that says only submit the items that are in the list, that doesn't keep somebody from coming along and submitting the data to me with junk in that field. Make sense? And so we never want to trust user input. We always want to validate user input. You can actually create validation layers with SQLAlchemy, but it's not really the best to do that. It feels a little bit kludgy to me. I think it could have done a better job of doing that. I've worked a little bit in Rails, and Rails had a really nice, I felt like, framework for building their validation directly into their entities. And I just never really, I even built something, but even then I wasn't happy with it. So didn't really get there with SQLAlchemy, and instead we decided to let's put a layer in front of SQLAlchemy that will do this type of validation for us. For a long time, that was just the form library. The problem with the form libraries is we started to have situations where we didn't really have a form anymore. We just had APIs. And so there wasn't really a need to have the UI stuff. There wasn't a need to have widgets. We really just needed something to do that serialization and validation dance. Enter what library, Bill? Enter Marshmallow. So Marshmallow is in particular is not SQLAlchemy specific. So you'll see here that they have an artist. A schema is really just a collection of attributes that have a certain type. And so you have an artist schema, and artist has a name, so I think they're thinking about albums and artists as in like musicians. And so you've got an album which has a title, a release date, and artist. And then the artist is linked to a different artist object. So you can see how this would be very representative of what you had in a database. You'd have an albums table that had a title, a release date, and an artist field. And you'd have an artist, well, it would have an artist ID column, probably, that has a foreign key to an artist's table, which would have name and possibly some other fields. So can anybody see where, if I was going to do this in SQLAlchemy, I would first have to build an artist entity, and then I would have to build an album entity, and then I would have to link them using SQLAlchemy tools in SQLAlchemy, and then I would have to come into the Marshmallow schema, and I would have to repeat all of that work to a field, right? Like everything that I'm doing in Marshmallow is going to be a duplication of what I've already done. Now there might be some extra stuff you do, but it's usually not going to be any less than. It's always going to be a superset of what the database model looks like. Any questions about Marshmallow at this point or what it does? Okay, so let's look at one more library and then we'll look at some code. So it makes sense that other people, smart developers like me, are going to say, I don't want to keep writing Marshmallow schemas when I've got a SQLAlchemy schema, which basically gives you everything you would need to build the marshmallow schema. And so I don't even know what this library is called, but what do you have to search for? How about marshmallow SQLAlchemy? Let's just try that. SQL. Okay, let's do it the other way. Let's do SQLAlchemy marshmallow. And lo and behold, somebody who's very creative in their naming schemes came up with marshmallow SQLAlchemy. And so marshmallow SQLAlchemy lets us declare our SQLAlchemy models. So now we've got author and book. It would have been really helpful if they were like said, hey, you know, the marshmallow doc should be using alchemy and artist. Let's do that. But they're not. They're doing it author and book, which is fine. You know, whatever. And they've made all their connections here. And then this is their marshmallow schema. Now, does anybody like this better? I like this better. Right? Makes sense. Okay? So, in our code, what that looks like is we've created our schema, and we're going to ignore this for right now. We're going to ignore that, and we're going to ignore that. I'll come back to those. And so, you remember I created my user. So I'm using model schema here, and I'll tell you why I subclass these and change some things. But at the end of the day, it's really just the same model schema with a few modifications that they're using in the docs. And then you create two schemas from that. One for the case where you have a single user object coming through, and then you have another one where you basically have a list of user objects. That's why you've got two schemas created there from the one definition. Make sense? And then there's other things you can do and feed in other variables, but that's not really important for us at the moment. So I'm big on what? Testing. I'm big on testing. So we're going to look at some tests. Okay, so this is all that I have for my model tests. And this model base does some things for us. Once again, we do this stuff all the time. We have the same set of base tests in all of our projects for all of our entities. And so we'll run those tests on the model, make sure that they pass. So I'm just running py.test, test model, no, test entities, test entities.py. And I get 4 tests, and it doesn't really matter what they were. But my model works. It's hooked up correctly. If I run the development server and try to use it, it's not a flake out of it. So I've also written some schema tests, and typically I wouldn't write these because I would assume the library kind of works the way it is. But since this was my first time using the library, I wanted to do something to make sure it was all kind of set up correctly. And so here I'm going to go ahead, and this is my first test of the schema. And so what I want to do is I want to create a database record, or a database object, really. Marshmallow doesn't care that there's a database under it. It just cares that it has a Python object with some attributes and some data. It doesn't really care where I got that. I could have got that from a web API somewhere. I could get it from a database. None of that really matters to Marshmallow. This is that testing create method, although it's not doing anything useful for me at the moment because I'm end up feeding all the values that I'm sending in anyway. But I'm doing that for a reason, because down here I want to check to make sure that the specific values I expected are what I got. And so if I didn't do this, I would have to use the Bob object and compare name first to Bob.name first, and that's kind of a testing anti-pattern. And so it's better to just, if you're going to expect this particular value, it's better to feed that in at the beginning of the test, and so that you're checking like string literal creation with a string literal, or a date or a number, and then your test is checking for that same thing. So anyway, I create the Bob user, and so I call schemas, which is my Python module. I kept wanting to call it a model. and I pull that user object off of it, so that's this. I'm getting a hold of this object. And now I call dump, which is a method that Marshmallow is providing me for deserializing? Serializing. For serializing into, in this case, Python. So I'm serializing from the object to dictionaries. They also provide a dump S, which would dump it into a JSON string, but for right now, we don't want to do that JSON string dance back and forth. And then they call, and then I get the .data from it. There's another, I think there's a .errors as well, which we'll look at here in just a second, which is why you don't just get the dictionary back. You want to check for errors, which actually I should do that here.
Why don't they make the errors an exception?
You know, I think you can actually. Who has that? Me? Sorry, I think you can. It's just it's a flag you set on your. I think it's a flag you set right here, if I remember correctly. Okay, so now I've got dictionaries instead of an object with attributes, and I assert that all those are equal, and they are. So now I want to test deserialization. So I want to test going from dictionaries to creating my object. So I'm going to start with dictionaries, and I'm going to end up with an SQLAlchemy entity object. So I created a method up here to get my user data, so I didn't have to create that every time I wrote a test. And so now I take that data and I feed it to that same user schema, but I call load this time. And I get a result. I assert that I don't have errors. And then now I'm using the attribute method because that's how you get access to data on an SQLAlchemy entity instance. And I assert that all that data is correct. So, makes sense? Anybody have a question about what we're doing here? In some sense, usually this dance between object and dictionary is not something you would typically do. I mean, we're really just setting up for the conversion to JSON, which is really what we're going for, but it's just easier to test with the dictionaries. Okay, so now I'm going through and I'm testing, so that user data method that I created up above, I can feed in different values with keyword arguments using the data.update method on the dictionary. And so I'm creating a string of 60 characters and sending it into both of my names. And I load the data, I assert that there's errors, and then I make sure that the error message that comes through makes sense for what I was expecting. Now note that in my schema creation, I did not have to do anything with validators. Why? Why didn't I have to create a validator here? It did come from SQLAlchemy. How? I defined it on the model, and what library knew that and put it into the Marshmallow schema? Marshmallow SQLAlchemy. So that's not really SQLAlchemy on its own. SQLAlchemy is just saying we've got a maximum length on those fields of 50. So that's where we've defined that constraint. Marshmallow provides a max length validator, but it has to be configured. Marshmallow SQLAlchemy is the library that's reading the SQLAlchemy, it's reflecting the SQLAlchemy data model, recognizing that there's a max length, creating a max length validator or a length validator with a max of 50, and then creating our Marshmallow field with that validator part of it. So let me show you that. All right, I'll do it. I'll make it bigger. I can terminal and via
Control-Shift+.
I guess I could. Control-Shift+. No.
And you want to make it bigger, right?
Yeah, but I want to go over a terminal in here. I just can't remember how to do it. Does anybody remember?
Anyways, I don't know. Bottom of the second.
Do what?
Going down to the bottom, right, up to the bottom of the second, top of the row there. Going up, right there.
What was I going to show? Forget now. Oh, okay, I remember. Rapid develop shell. All right, so what this is dropping me into is a Python prompt where my Rapid app is set up and kind of ready to run. And so we are going to, from rapid.model.schema, import user. It's right there. You read it up top, you cheater. All right, so is that English? All right, I know this isn't easy to read, but if you notice, so this is on Marshmallow, this is the field object that Marshmallow uses to kind of define the metadata of that field. And so we don't have a default value. We didn't assign a default value for this field. I don't know what the attribute does. But here we've got a validate object. And in that validate, we've got a length with max equal to 50. You see that? So Marshmallow is doing the validation, but I didn't have to manually set it up because Marshmallow SQLAlchemy did that for me. It recognized the max length limit, or the limit on the field. It knew it needed to create a length validator, and it used that when it created the name first field, name last field, and name first for that matter.
Can you override it?
Can I override what? The validator? Sure, yep. In fact, I do a little override here in just a second. I'll talk about why I did that. Okay, so now we've got a valid Marshmallow schema. And we know where we're trying to get, right? We're trying to get to that React library that'll build the form for us. What does that React library need in order to build the form for us? Does anybody remember what it was called? It needs JSON schema, which is a standard that's been developed for specifying a data model using JSON. So how do we get there? We've got the Marshmallow SQLAlchemy, which is creating a Marshmallow schema. So now we've got a Marshmallow schema. We need to get a JSON schema from it. How can we do that? Go ahead, say it. What is it? Yeah, you use Marshmallow JSON schema. We're really grateful that we don't have creative names here, because it makes Googling very easy. And lo and behold, this Steve Furry guy, I'm assuming that's what his name is, unless he's really called Furry Steve. Can you imagine your parents name you that? That would be awful. This guy has already created this for us. He mentions, and actually, I found this before I found the JSON, before I found the React library. He was the one that linked to some of these forms. And so, he's showing me exactly what I would expect to see, which is I simply have a class from his project, I feed it the schema, and it gives me some JSON. And I love it, because I have to do a lot less work. So now I'm gonna get this JSON schema, and I know I'm still just on the Python side. I realize this is what I'm gonna get, and I'm gonna have to feed this somehow through an API. I'm gonna have to give my React code the ability to get this through an AJAX request, and that's still some work to come, but I have what I want, right? The hard part is go from SQLAlchemy and get a valid JSON schema. And once I have that, I know that I can feed that through a view to my React. Any questions so far about any of this? Okay. So, I come in here to my views, and I import my JSON schema, and don't worry about this guy for a second, and I feed it to my JSONify function, which Flask gives me, which will take a Python data dictionary object, turn it into JSON. It's wonderful. Once again, I don't want to do any of this by hand. And spit it out with the proper content type, which JSONify does that for me. It creates a response object that has a content type set to whatever it is, application JSON. And so now I have an API that's available to me at the URL API user schema. So if this is still running, it is, I can okay, so there's my JSON. And I'm getting all of that simply by defining my SQLAlchemy entity and hooking some stuff up into it. Any questions? Okay, so let's look at the React side. I'm not. I like React. We've adopted it at work. I'm not a React expert, so you'll probably see bad React. Do not assume that my React is good. Don't model. This is not a model. This is just me trying to throw something together and learn a little bit along the way. So I used to create React app. So create React app is a project that Facebook put together to make it easy to bootstrap a React application without having to worry about Webpack and what else has to be in there? Babel and yeah, all that stuff. You just don't have to worry about all that. They take care of it, all of it for you. So great documentation. If you want to get started with React, I highly recommend starting with Create React App and then using that as kind of a base model. So that
later, you can't get anything done with it.
Do what?
5 minutes later, it's too constrained. What's too constrained? Create React.
It's not really. Bill's picky.
It's designed with zero configuration.
That's true. And there are limitations to it, but start there, eject, so you can eject, and at least you can use Create React App like a boilerplate. So eject immediately if you want to, and then you can tweak everything. Bill's just upset because he had to fill a file watcher to get the file moved to the right place.
Webpack already has a file watcher.
All right, well maybe you'll convince me we should eject someday. Get Brady to take your side and you guys can gang up on me. All right. See, now you got me confused. I don't remember what I was doing. Oh yeah. All right, so I guess I can show this in the tree here. Close those, and that's my back-end code. So my front-end code. So I do like the way Create React App sets up its application. It seems pretty straightforward to me. This is my source code. I've got an index file which I added some routing to, and then you've got an app, which is where you see, are you ready to rumble? Right? Are you ready to rumble? I should have said, are you ready to react? And then, hey, look, this is actually pretty cool. Watch this. Save it. Don't even need to refresh. It auto refreshes. What's that called? Hot reloading or something like that? That's really cool. It's really nice when it's just JavaScript because the page doesn't kind of flash like that. It just reloads the JavaScript. Okay, so this is my first page, and then I linked in the navigation here to take me to Form 1. Anyone want to guess me what my component's going to be called? Come on, naming. What's my component going to be called? Form 1. Oh, that was so easy. All right, so in my component, I have Form 1. Now, Form 1 for us, I didn't want to do any JavaScript or anything. I just kind of wanted to show what this looks like. So I have to get the library, the JavaScript library React JSON schema form, which is what we looked at earlier, which is provided by Mozilla Services. And we take that form object, or right here, I'm sorry, and we feed it a schema. And that schema we just manually created in the JSON schema format to give us a name last and a name first property, and to specify that both of those were required. Pretty straightforward. And so if I try to submit this, I don't even think this is JavaScript validation at this point. I think that's actually HTML5 validation that's working right there. Because I don't have any special validation stuff built in. Unless it's that form library. Yeah, I think that's HTML.
It's, yeah, because you don't have no validating on the form, so that's from the...
Okay. Okay, so that's how we get our form. And obviously, I hope what we want to do with Form 2 is rather than specify the schema in our JavaScript, we want to get our API from our Python application, get that JSON blob, and have it created. So, anybody want to guess what the next component name is going to be? Come on. What? Marshmallow. We should have. I should have named it marshmallow. Okay. Oh, that's weird. I didn't name it right here, but it doesn't matter. Oh, that's interesting. Where it is. Huh. Learned something new about the JavaScript import system. Oh, look at that. App is not defined. Form 2. I didn't refresh, it did that all on its own. This is so cool, I love that. Okay, and now we'll go to Form 2. And we've got our form. And that's coming directly from JSON schema. I'm not building any of those fields, and I'll prove it. So this is Form 2. This is my form. It's taking the schema from this state.schema. I'm getting my state by using the component will mount, which is an event that fires before the React object is rendered in the browser. And so I use the fetch API to call API user schema, and then I use the fetch API to fulfill those promises, and ultimately save that state that I get from that response into this.schema. And then that's ultimately that. When that API request finishes, React takes care of recognizing that the state has changed, and it will automatically re-render with all of those form fields. So if you watch closely, you'll actually see that the form starts off, I don't know if you saw that, but the form starts off with the button all the way at the top, and then it quickly fills in. And what's actually happening is that button exists because none of the schema is there at the very beginning, and then that the AJAX request completes, and then the rest of the fields fill in. I don't know if you see that. I'm sure there'd be a better way to demonstrate that, but that's what's happening. Okay, so this did not all work as plug and play easily as I would have liked it to. So let's talk about issue number 1. Issue number 1 for me was that, and let me find my test. I did not like the fact that by default, a required marshmallow field would allow an empty string. To me, that doesn't make sense. To them it does, because they're saying it's not missing, the field was there, and it's not none, it's an empty string. But to me, knowing I'm working with form fields and I'm almost always feeding either API data or form data, none of that stuff's really going to get turned into none unless it's turned into none by Marshmallow. So if I've got an empty string, I don't want that to be considered valid. Unfortunately, fixing that ended up turning out to be more difficult than I would have expected. If I was going to create the field on Marshmallow manually, I would just, when I was doing the max length of 50, I could easily put a min length of 1, and that would have solved the problem for me. The problem is, even though Marshmallow SQLAlchemy gives me an easy way to override fields, I kind of have to do all of the validators as a, I would have to kind of override all of the validators at once. And I didn't want that. I wanted the max field to be there. I wanted the max length of 50 to be there. And so what I ended up having to do is override model converter, and ultimately this add column keyword args is what Marshmallow SQLAlchemy, this is the function, the method that creates the keyword arguments for based on the SQLAlchemy model. And so what I do is I call super, and then if my Marshmallow field ends up being required, I'm going to add another validator to check for that minimum length, and rather than using the default message, I'm going to do something that's very specific to what I'm trying to do, which is the empty string is not valid for the required field. And then I'm going to add that validator to keyword args validate, which is a list of validators. And so my test for that looks like I've got 3 required fields here. Dependence is required, name first and name last are required. So name last and dependence worked out of the box. Missing data for required field, field may not be null, and it's this name first that's actually testing the logic that I added. Empty string not valid for required field. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Okay. So these other things that I did here, the base options. The base option is what I had to do to get SQLAlchemy, Marshmallow SQLAlchemy to use this model converter that I overrode as the default instead of the one that it's going to use from the library. And then I had to override model schema and use this options class to point to the base options that I just created. And finally, I get this base model schema, which is what I use for all of my schemas. So kind of do a little bit of work up front, but then obviously if I had 20 schemas, they would all have this same logic for a required field, that the empty string is not valid for required field. Any questions about that? Okay, so the second issue that I had was okay, so the second issue I had is JSON schema, Marshmallow JSON schema for an integer field was producing a field that looked like, instead of type integer, it was like type number and then format integer. That's what it was looking like. And if you notice, this just turned to an X because that's not valid. It throws an error. Oh, and now it's back to a check. What's that? Oh, is that my problem? Okay. Here you go. And this was the error. Unsupported field schema.
And numbers or numbers?
You know, I don't know. I checked this. This works. But if I here, let me show you. I'll prove it.
The issue is, so is the issue that it returned, it accepts only an integer at the formal layer, but then it converts it to a float and it needs an icon?
No, it's in the. Let me just show you. So if I take this and I do. I do dependence, and I do type integer. So that works. But that's not how the JSON was coming out by default. By default, the JSON was coming out like this. And that's what I would get. No, make it integer if you type a number. So I could read the docs enough to tell that that form library gives you the ability, it has different display widgets depending upon what type, and that's what it uses the format for. But for some reason, the guy that built Marshmallow JSON schema, for some reason, he's building his integers as another type of format integer, which didn't make sense to me. I filed a bug, asking him, see if that was really the way it was supposed to be. So what I ended up having to do is override how JSON schema was generating an integer. And so I did that. Here in my views. I wouldn't normally do this in views. I would put it off somewhere in the utility library or something, but it was expedient. And so that's what I'm doing right here. I'm checking. I'm subclassing. I'm grabbing the method that's most applicable to what I'm trying to do. And I get the value that his method returns, but then I go in here, and if it's an integer, I set the type to integer, and I delete the format key, and so make it what the React library is expecting. So that was the first thing I had to do. The second thing I did was, so notice my field names aren't very pretty now, and that's because, once again, Marshmallow JSON schema, rather than taking a pretty version, which admittedly it's kind of hard to have a good algorithm that gets that right every time, but they just took whatever the field name was and kind of filled it in for the title. And so what I did is I said, well, for the most part, if I take these and capitalize them and get rid of underscore, I'm going to get pretty close. And so I did that, but then I recognized that my name first and my name last was kind of wonky. So if there was name in the string, I turned it into a list first, swapped them, then capitalized them, then joined them on spaces, which I'll show you what that code looks like. It looks awful. It's
that
really,
code would not merge.
Oh, really? What's wrong with this?
Needs fixing.
What's wrong with this? I split on an underscore, I reverse, and then I join and use dot title. What's wrong with that?
Let's hack with 3 lines of
All right, fair enough. But I don't work for Canonical, and I wasn't getting paid to do this. So, all right. So now that that's fixed, I think I saved it. If I click here and then click back here, now I get capitalized, and my UTC isn't right. So really, what I would really like to do, SQLAlchemy actually has an attribute called data or something like that, where you can just arbitrarily kind of add information into that field, not into the data, but into the definition of the field. And so ideally, you would write Marshmallow SQLAlchemy to properly take the name out of the SQLAlchemy field and use that, and then you would set up Marshmallow JSON schema to read that data and put it in title instead, and then it would all be set up correctly. And honestly, at this point, the libraries are thin enough. If you got sick of using other people's libraries, you just write this yourself. This could easily be written in a day by somebody who's kind of familiar with what's going on and is good at Python. So this is how I ended up with a form built in React from a SQLAlchemy data model. Questions, comments, concerns?
Question.
Sure.
So it looks like, you basically have your entire database model here in Swim. What if you only wanted to show certain fields there? And it also looks like they're ordered alphabetically, working in order differently.
Yeah, so React JSON schema form does all that stuff. So they do, they have this thing called the UI schema object, and you can do object field orderings. So this is how you would order it right there. And they have one for filtering fields. I just forget what it was. I don't know, but I think there's something in here. Excuse me. Maybe it's in here. Nested widgets, ordering, custom. Does custom do it? No. Somewhere in here they do it. And the I'm pretty sure Marshmallow SQLAlchemy also allows you to limit what fields that it's going to do. So at each layer you've got some options for kind of tweaking and limiting. But the ideal would be anything from a presentation perspective at this point would all be done in React using this UI schema thing that they give you, the UI schema object right here. So they're pretty flexible. This library seems pretty popular. They have a lot of flexibility in it about how it renders. Most of your UI stuff is going to go here. The only reason I really want the title in the Python layer is because when I generate validation messages, it would be nice to have the names of those fields instead of field names. So when you show the user an error, it would be nice to show the actual field name as it's displayed and not name underscore last. Anything else?
Have you seen implementations of this used with Redux and how it's used?
No. I haven't seen implementations of this, period. Like, this was all something I threw together. I stumbled across the Marshmallow JSON schema thing, and I was like, oh, that's cool. And then I just started thinking, if they do that, I bet you they build the forms, and then he even, or the library, they have JavaScript libraries, and he even linked to them. And I thought, oh, I bet you I can create Marshmallow from SQLAlchemy, found that library, and just kind of strung it all together. Is this exciting for you, Bill?
Well, I guess I'm going to be using that next week or so.
In the next week?
So how different is what Marshmallow JSON schema spits out than just Marshmallow standard serialization?
So Marshmallow standard serialization deals with the data. So if I feed in Randy, Syring, it's going to, Marshmallow is going to validate the data against that schema. Marshmallow JSON schema is creating this. Okay. So it's creating a JSON object that represents the metadata. It's the fields and what type those fields are. If there's validators on it, that's what JSON schema is doing.
So how many layers?
So you got SQLAlchemy, and then you've got Marshmallow SQLAlchemy, which is creating the Marshmallow schemas, and then you've got Marshmallow JSON schema, which is taking the Marshmallow schema and turning it into a data structure that looks like the JSON schema spec, and then you've got to take that, turn it into actual JSON, a JSON string, which Flask does, and serve that over an API. And then you've got React, and in React and JavaScript, you've got to hit that API. And then once you get the JSON back from that API and get the data structure as an object, then you've got to feed that to whatever form library you're using. So, I don't know, 7 maybe?
All that was for the validation, that's what they do all the.
So all of that for being able to get my data model defined and my validation defined once. That's my main goal. Now that's not technically true because from a usability perspective, you're probably going to have some JavaScript that you write to help the user, just to help their user experience. So that you're not going to write that in Python probably. So there's probably going to be some duplication of validation logic. But even then, for the stuff that's not easily translatable to JavaScript, you can have a validation API that feeds the data to the Marshmallow validator. It'll spit out the errors. You take those errors, spit it back as JSON, and then your form library reads those errors and puts it back into the form without a page post. So it's not real-time JavaScript validation. It's taking an AJAX request and back, but these days that seems pretty acceptable.
Maybe, when you talk to your mother, if I say the JSON and then all the values and Marshmallow and probably the SQLAlchemy.
Yep, lots of layers.
I think that's important to have on, you touched on the difference between that business logic validation on the front end versus the back end. I think it's been super successful, especially onboard new devs, to have so much of the business logic on the front end, and of course a lot of the type, the type of your variable validation on the client, and of course we'll go through the outside. But then anything related to like your business domain, like inventory levels or fitting, let's say, that's a post up with Axios, asynchronous call, and then you can get that feedback and say, that isn't good.
Yeah. So as much as I can do immediately, that's better. But there's going to be some things that you want to write it on your server because you need that validation, but you don't really want to duplicate that in JavaScript. So 3 layers of validation, I guess.
There's a library called Flow. It's basically adding typing to JavaScript without using TypeScript. And it's super useful for testing and then like encapsulating your different structures. So you don't have to redeclare your schema in different reaction points. You just say, import this type that I've created, plug and play. But then I think that kind of will end up breaking this flow because you're grabbing the schema and you're not declaring it on the front. So I think it's just like depending on your needs, figure out which one to use.
Yeah, and, if you're building a really big spa and you've got a data model layer in your JavaScript, then I think you're going to want to make that as robust as possible. I'm kind of going from the other direction because at least typically for level 12, we do a lot more back-end stuff than we do front-end. And so I really want to make the front-end kind of as thin as possible. And as a consulting company, I don't get a whole lot of time to kind of, I want to save the laborious stuff for the things that have to be laborious. So if I can create a schema in JavaScript automatically from what I've already built in SQLAlchemy, I think that's just a huge win for us as we continue to kind of build some tooling around that to be able to get our CRUD kind of almost automatic in JavaScript just based on defining it in SQLAlchemy. That seems kind of like a no-brainer. We don't do enough on the front end to need a really well-validated data model or typed data model. Anything else? All right. Thanks for coming. I'll hang out for a little bit. If you got any questions, feel free to grab some pizza on the way out or a drink for the road, or stay and chat for a while if you want to.
We're just in Pile Isle.
Oh, we're going to Pile Isle. Anybody else want to go to Pile Isle? It's this weekend. It's a Python user or regional conference. It's in Columbus, 3-hour drive. Level 12 is hiring. I got a couple jobs on the careers post or the careers page. If anybody's interested or knows somebody who's looking for a job, feel free to have them go take a look. Anything else?
PyCon was a couple months ago, and all the videos are posted on YouTube if you.
I think it just came out like yesterday or the day before. Or no, I'm sorry, that was Friday.
I heard really good things about. There was one of the keynotes at PyCon was on microservices. It's a big buzzword right now, and I heard that the guy who did that did a really good job. I haven't had a chance to listen to it.
Tutorial on microservices.
I think it was done by the same guy. Oh, maybe not the same guy.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Beginner question.
Okay.
For those of us who are going to be just starting Python
Yep.
programming,
Okay.
what text editor, IDE, or what do you recommend?
Anything Microsoft. I would suggest these days. I would suggest Microsoft Visual Studio Code, and I've not been a big Microsoft fan, but it is really a cool editor. You can also use Atom, which is it GitHub that does Atom? GitHub's editor. I think it's a little bit slower. Visual Studio is really fast, even though it's a JavaScript-based editor. There's Sublime. There's PyCharm if you're gonna do a lot of stuff in Python. Anybody else? You learn Vim.
Brains.
Vim?
Yeah, Vim.
Yes, if you feel very
How much difference is Python? Of course, I use straight text editor, straight CSS stuff, but what's the difference between something like PyCharm, IDE, and
Yeah, so PyCharm's going to give you a leg up. They're going to have embedded debuggers, and they're going to be tailored for doing Python development.
But it's probably worth it if you look at it.
Honestly, I tell you to start with Microsoft Visual Studio Code. I think it's a good opening editor to start with. Get comfortable in it, and then if you want to experiment with other stuff, do it. But it's popular. It's gaining popularity. It's got good plugins for Python. It's fast, so I think it'd be worth starting there if you don't have any other. If you don't have a good reason to start someplace else, it's a good place to start.
Eclipse, Python, plugin.
Yeah, there's a Python plugin for Eclipse. I personally don't like the Java IDEs. I just don't like them for some reason. They just don't. They're not intuitive to me. So I try to stay away from PyCharm. Is that what you use? You use PyCharm?
No, Bill does.
You use PyCharm? Does it feel very Java IDE-ish?
No, it doesn't feel like, I felt that way about Max, or not Max, Eclipse.
Yeah.
Like, you always just felt like he's kind of slow, just a couple milliseconds slower than I'd like. But,
PyCharm's good.
yeah, PyCharm's real smooth.
Okay.
The IntelliJ IDE is written in Kotlin, like a statically typed language, and because like PyCharm, WebStorm, Android Studio, they're all forks of IntelliJ. What's really cool about it is you can make it as minimalist as you want, and I've made mine to pretty much emulate Vim very closely. And then I can then take those settings, export the settings jar, and then take that to Android Studio, then take that to WebStorm, then take that to PHP Store.
Just curious, why would you take a Java app and turn it into Vim if you just use Vim?
Because there's so much customization, I modified like 24 keystrokes with keybindings. So to have that flexibility and then take it to these other IDEs for your Android app or your iOS app, is having to memorize all your different customized keystrokes across.
You know, I solved that. I just don't use any keystrokes. I mouse everything. Actually, that's not true. But I think I mouse a lot of more things than other people, just because I don't program enough these days to remember, which sucks. Anything else? If you need to go, feel free to get up and leave.